Welcome, folks, to today's podcast, The People Prescription. Today, we've got Kirstie Buck, founder of Common Ground Workplace Mediation. We're covering a lot of ground, really, today. We're going to be going through how to handle difficult conversations, where mediation fits into that. We're looking at Kirstie's business, Common Ground Mediation, the origin stories and what the business stands for, what Kirstie stands for as the founder of that company. We're also looking at what mediation is particularly in the SME space. We're looking at things like how we can avoid conflict in the workplace initially, and what's a good mediation look like? What's the recipe behind that? We're looking at things like how to rebuild trust and why it pays to look at that as an approach first and foremost for any business, and share some stories too about what's happened between us, 30 years of working in the people ops space. And we're looking at things like AI generated grievances. Seems like quite a hot topic at the moment, Kirstie, so I'm looking forward to catching up with you on that too, and ultimately bringing it to a close. What happens where a potential honest outcome or a mature truth could be a potential exit for an employee, and how that fits into the common ground that we're trying to achieve, with mediation being a possible solution. Great to have you with us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks so much for having me. It's been, I'm really excited to get into this conversation.
Let us know a bit more about Common Ground. What made you start it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Common Ground Workplace Mediation pull on my decade in HR from the corporate side, and really focusing on, the name is very intentional, looking at where can we find the common ground. Conflict is inevitable. There's always going to be disputes and challenges because people are people. But it's looking at how can we find the most human way through this. I've seen conflict play out throughout my whole career in HR and prior to HR as well, and really seen the negative impact that either formal internal processes such as grievances and disciplinaries, or extensive legal processes like employment tribunals have on the people. And it's not just those folks that are closest to it, but it's also that ripple effect, and it's how it permeates through the whole of the business. For me, mediation is a really exciting space because for me, there's a different way of doing it. There's a different way of supporting people through that conflict.
Absolutely. And yeah, again, bringing it home in terms of, okay, why are we speaking about this on the People Prescription, folks? It's a huge cost to an organization to have disagreements and conflict for UK employers to deal with. Doing some research ahead of the podcast, we've been looking at things like, okay, what's ultimately the cost? And £28.5 billion cost of workplace conflict for UK employers. And again, that's drawn on pre-pandemic figures from places like ACAS. And whilst they are estimates, it gives you a really good illustration of ultimately, if you break that down, that's like £1,000 plus per employee per year, which spread across every employee within your business. That can be a huge cost for an organization. You know, if there's informal approaches compared to formal approaches, we're going to be looking at the informal resolution approach. And 2 in 3 of employees that potentially look at considering resignation don't necessarily bring up the conflict. They never inform their business leaders about that challenge until it becomes a problem. Again, looking at an informal approach, it can really surface things quite quickly for organizations. So it's great to have you on the podcast, Kirstie. And let's get into it. What would you say is the recipe then for a good mediation from your perspective? What would you say if you're walking us through a bit of a session or a joint session with an organization? Is it voluntary? Do you recommend breaks? What would you say is the kind of process description for a business leader that's considering the whole mediation route as an option?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the process, I can take you through the sort of steps that we follow. But ultimately, it's really about being present with the person that's in front of you. Mm-hmm. So really being present with them, understanding what is going on, really allowing people to be seen and to be heard. So the initial step is very much that initial introduction call, that discovery call with the business owner, with the MD, with the team leader, whoever on the business side has engaged me, and really then looking to understand what's the context, what's the situation, what's going on. At that point, it is very much an open situation of perhaps mediation is the right point here, perhaps it's not.
This is perfect. I think being able to break it down as well from if you think about it as 100-head manufacturing business, if they're carrying, say, using those figures, that's potentially £100,000 worth of conflict costs before any sort of single solicitor's letters arrives. Breaking this down for people really helps them understand, okay, what's the alternative? But ultimately as well, what's that impact on the owner's P&L? That's really why we're talking about what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It would start with that initial discovery call. At that point, it's a very open conversation with that business owner. I'm not looking to push them down any specific route. It might be that the issue that they raise, actually, I'm fairly confident that mediation might not be the right route at that point.
Right.
It might be connecting with someone like yourself from an HR consultant perspective. Maybe there's other spaces to go down here. So it's really understanding the meat of the situation, what's happening here. If mediation is the right route, and I'm glad you mentioned about the voluntary piece, that's then the point at which that business owner, that MD, that team leader seeks the clarity from the participants involved. Mediation is entirely voluntary. It's very much a consent-driven process. We're not pushing anyone down any specific route. It's really saying, there's a different way to tackle conflict in the workplace. This is an option that is open to you. Is it something you want to explore? It's not forced on anyone. It is entirely voluntary. People can step out at any point that they need to. So that consent is a really important part of it. Once everyone's on board, then it's pre-mediation. So conversations with the individuals on a one-to-one basis, typically on a Teams call or a phone call, depending on the nature of the business and the availability of everyone, etc. And that's really to dig a lot deeper. So that's giving each individual, typically there'll be two, so each person, we're really drilling down into the detail. Certainly from my perspective, it's obviously establishing rapport, understanding, sharing a bit about me and what I'm bringing there, what they can expect from the process, which is really important. Right. Certainly if people are already, if they're in conflict, there's a big emotional side to that. So for me, it's about establishing who I am, clarifying what the process looks like so they know what to expect, and then really digging into their side of the story. What's going on here? What is the challenge that they're experiencing? And more importantly, what they want from an outcome. What is it? What does good look like for them? What would be an ideal situation? And what's maybe a backup option as well? What does that look like? And again, on the other side.
What I'm hearing there, Kirstie, is that a lot of what you shared, it seems that the conflicts necessarily don't need like a formal process of like a legal justice system or a tribunal, an employment tribunal. They need a conversation. And to unpack that from what you shared, this seems like a much more flexible, much more approachable way in which to address conflict in the workplace or a misunderstanding. And I'm also getting a sense it's about catching it early too, to be able to find that agreeable way forward to resolve a challenge, perhaps that nobody's really spoken about before. Certainly drawing on my experience in people ops, a lot of the time when a grievance lands, if it's a complaint from an employee, the challenge is it's already happened. So to be able to consider this as an option, perhaps to avoid like escalation, that seems like a really healthy approach to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And exactly as you say, I'm sure anyone who's working in HR can absolutely empathise. As you say, by the point that grievance has been raised, there's already really hurt parties involved. You're effectively working off the back foot. So it's how can we tackle this early? How can we identify where something is shifted in a team where there's tension there? And that might be explosive. That might also be really quiet. It might be someone who's normally really chatty has withdrawn and they're not contributing in the same way they previously have done. They might not be engaging with sort of social activities in the same way they have done previously. It's always about identifying what the baseline is for different employees and how that's then changed, and really sensing what's going on within the team, ideally before it gets to raising that grievance.
I'm with you. So when we're looking at this sort of mediation recipe, one of the things that I find quite useful is understanding the confidentiality aspect really of a complaint. A lot of the time, these kind of topics that come up in a disagreement, they might be quite sensitive. They could be confidential to a certain extent. And one thing I'm minded, especially when we're looking at informal approaches, is typically with disputes within people ops circles, you're perhaps looking at like having a without prejudice conversation, which for those that are not familiar with that term, it's really like an off the record conversation around perhaps an existing dispute that's happened, and you're trying to make a genuine attempt as an employer to settle that particular claim. And a lot of owners I speak to, business leaders, they can assume sometimes that what's said in a mediation doesn't necessarily be surfaced later on. How do you handle that? Because from what I've understood, mediation, confidentiality, is it more contractual? Is it something like an agreement between two people? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I see mediation, one is it's effectively a facilitated conversation. It absolutely is confidential. The beauty with it is it works similarly to without prejudice conversation, where you have this space of being able to speak much more openly. I always liken it to effectively, if say a grievance has already been raised, you're pressing pause on that process. The beauty of mediation is that it doesn't stop you from, as either an employee or an employer, from being able to continue down any internal formal processes or the legal route. It effectively just offers you an alternative solution. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, you can still come back to those original formal processes. But as you say, the confidentiality is a really important piece. It is very much nothing is being shared outside of this room. This is us having a very open conversation. It's not legally binding. And I think that piece is really important to remember, because we're not looking to tread on eggshells. We're not being really cautious. It's really genuinely being able to open up that conversation, to be able to get to the heart of it without either side worrying about what they should or shouldn't say. It's being able to be a lot more open, but equally knowing that both sides have the opportunity to continue down those formal routes if for whatever reason it doesn't work. It's important to note again that anything that is shared during a mediation is not legally admissible, you can't use that in a tribunal, for example, because it is an entirely confidential process.
Understood. And from the perspective of from a business leader's point of view then, so are there any like early signs that you've recognized, or a trend based on many years in people ops and going through the mediation piece, that you would suggest perhaps leaders not necessarily ignore? Or are there any like common triggers that you see? It could be communication styles perhaps, or outside pressures that can transfer into work from the employee's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are so many. And I think when I reflect on what do early signs look like, I'm loath to be a fence sitter on this, but it really does depend. It's very context specific. It depends on the people that are in your business. But ultimately, for me, the best advice I can give is knowing what the baseline of your people team looks like. If someone is normally really chatty, if they're really engaged, if they're normally first to put their hand up for a project, really involved, if they look like they're a bit quieter, they're maybe not taking on additional work, there's something else going on there. It's noticing that shift from their baseline. Everyone is obviously different. Some people are naturally more outgoing, chatty, extroverted, etc. Some people are normally much quieter. And it's just looking for the shift between that. So your chatty person who's become quieter, your quiet person who's suddenly become very loud. It's looking for that difference, and it's understanding, okay, there's something going on here. And my recommendation is always starting with curiosity. I fully appreciate, certainly with the current climate, there are business owners are handling so many different, really complex challenges. There is a lot going on, but I'd always recommend, certainly when it comes to people, and certainly when it comes to potential tension or something has shifted and it feels weird, it can be quite an intangible piece as well, but knowing that something just doesn't feel quite right is coming at it from curiosity. I am a big believer that people behave in certain ways, not for any particular random reason. There's usually something behind it. It could be they're tackling something personal at home. There could be something else going on in their home life. It could be there is a challenge at work. There's maybe a frustration that's there somewhere. It's coming from curiosity. So if, say, for example, that quiet person is getting louder and it is maybe more abrasive and it feels more as if they're attacking other people in the team, it's understanding, not immediately going in with the hammer. It's going, right, there's something going on with this person. What is it? And being able to carve out that time that's separate to thinking about both the physical and the emotional environment. So let's have a conversation, but let's not do it out on the shop floor with everyone else. Let's not go to their space where other people are listening. It's how can we pull that person away and have a conversation that enables them to feel comfortable, safe to share what could be something really sensitive and really personal and potentially really upsetting as well.
Exactly. Yeah. The big thing I'm hearing there as you're sharing that, Kirsty, is empathy is such a big part of this whole conversation. And what usually is underneath isn't necessarily what's the apparent thing. So asking people clearly, how are you doing? A lot of people I speak to, the key difference between being able to handle these situations in a way that's productive for everybody, both parties concerned, is making people feel seen, heard, understood. And the empathy piece is that in itself is a great way to resolve any potential currents or things that are going on or perhaps underneath, that you're peeling back the layers of it and trying to understand their perspective is such a big part of the leadership piece as well, and understanding, having the opportunity to have those conversations with people, because we know what it's like. You're running a business, there's lots of plates that are being spun all at once. So having well-trained leaders that ultimately understand how to have those conversations effectively is, and it's not necessarily the business owner, but it's their responsibility to then ultimately give their leadership team the tools to do these type of, have these kind of conversations and follow these processes properly. So catching it early is a big part of what I'm hearing there, and making sure that you can prevent challenges before they escalate. That's another big part of it. Coming back to the recipe though, I mean, what would you say? So let's say, for example, we've got to the point where there needs to be some kind of way to rebuild perhaps some trust that's been lost. And I find a lot of the time, especially in people ops, we look at themes and trends, and like you say, it does depend on, okay, well, what's fueling the grievance. But pay can be a big issue for a lot of people, that do, and that doesn't necessarily come out very early on in a conversation around this. It might be that cost of living is something that's affecting many employees and employers for that matter as well. And that can be sometimes the catalyst behind raising a concern initially with an employer. So being really transparent around that and understanding, okay, there are other themes and trends. It isn't necessarily just like a two personalities clashing. It could be other things that are going on for that particular person. But what would you say is the first step towards rebuilding trust?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I answer that, I do just want to pull on one of the things you've just said in terms of pay and people struggling to talk about some sort of different issues. I think one of the big things I always come back to is thinking about the grievance process. I'm sure many HR folks can really relate to this. The item that's being raised on the grievance is often not the issue there. It's typically, say, shifts have changed, something else has happened, and that's what the grievance is about. But it's so frequently much deeper than that. I would argue that one of the common threads is around people not being seen, people not being heard, people not being engaged and feeling disrespected. That, I would argue, is one of the common themes that's really coming out for so many of those. And that's what can be really difficult with a grievance when you're already in that process of, you're trying to tackle effectively the top level behavior, but actually it's the messy, deep stuff that needs the time and needs the work to sit with and to tease out and to hold mirrors up, for metaphorically, and to really get deep in that and really tease those different aspects out.
So describe that for me then. Walk me through, help me understand what that would look like in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's ultimately a lot of active listening. So as I say, it's initial pre-mediation one-to-one conversations. So you've got that space. And then when you're coming together, the most important piece at the start is giving both participants the opportunity to speak uninterrupted, to share their side of the story, and then to be able to look at getting that reflected back to them. So it can feel a little bit clunky initially, but that reflection piece, that I always talk about holding up a mirror metaphorically of,
Right.
I'm hearing XYZ, have I got that right? And again, it can feel uncomfortable and clunky, but it's a really great way to really, say, holding up a mirror and showing that other person, this is what I've understood from what you've said. Is that correct? And it gives them the opportunity to either go, yeah, absolutely, that's exactly it, or no, actually it's this and this. So again, it's that, it's constant clarification of, this is what I've heard, is this the situation? If not, please correct me, and being able to move forward. So the biggest part at the start is very much it's really being truly heard and seen initially before we're then moving on, teasing out where's the common ground, where's the disagreement, what are we aligned on, what are we looking as an outcome, are we aligned on that, and being able to move forward with that. At the end, there's then the option for a written agreement of next steps, but that is entirely at the discretion of the participants involved. That's not something that myself as a mediator, I wouldn't be involved with that. That's entirely up to them. Otherwise, a verbal agreement on what they want to do moving forward. After that, it's then 3-4 weeks or so after that joint mediation. It's then checking in with those people again individually, again at a space and a time that works for them, to understand what's shifted since the mediation. What are you feeling? What's going on? Has there been anything else that's come up? And really just making sure that certainly that duty of care is there, but really understanding, is there something that was missed? Actually, have we not tackled what was important there? And really hearing what else is going on.
And because it's voluntary throughout, it seems that consent is so central to what you've mentioned there. Is that something that, do you find there's a particular way of approaching that? Because ultimately things can get a bit prickly when there's a disagreement. So what would you suggest is a good place to start if you've got two people perhaps that are seeing a challenge in a slightly different way? How can you bring those people together? And is it about bringing them to an outcome and being very sort of outcome focused? Say, look, the reason we're doing this is because we want to achieve the mission for the business, for example, or trying to bring it to something that they both agree on, essentially.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned this. And I think the consent-driven part, mediation being voluntary, is so important. For me, in terms of my process, it's very much making that clear right at the start and reiterating it throughout. Again, certainly within that tension, within that conflict situation, emotions are high. I'm sure we can all think of times when we were in conflict with someone and you're just not hearing a lot. So it's being able to continually reiterate that message, providing that consistency to everyone that's involved with the process, and saying, look, you can stop at any point. You can take yourself out of this, either in, say, the joint mediation. We can have breaks at any point. We can have separate one-to-ones, having that space to break out sessions as and when needed. It's that continuing reiteration, because for me, ultimately, that's providing everyone that's involved with a sense of autonomy, knowing that they are in control of this situation. This isn't something that's being done to them. This is something that they are an active participant in, and that they have the opportunity to say, actually, you know what? I just need a minute. This is getting too heated, or I just need to actually gather my thoughts a bit. The same with using silence and space to be able to not just bombard people with information, constant chatter back and forth. There's an element of also creating space and creating silence to allow people to absorb information and to sit with it and to identify their own feelings and identify their thoughts. So pulling that out.
What you've just shared there, really, it's coming to that point around how the structure is so important, that consent is needed, and ultimately leads into the next part of really the whole process of mediation. From what I've understood so far, it's that, how do you get two people perhaps who don't see eye to eye at that stage, keeping them working together? It is keeping them working together a part of ever the answer? Is it keeping them, or keeping them apart? Is that potentially part of the answer to what would you suggest an employer considers as a way forward for that, where two people perhaps they're considering, do we continue working together or not? There may not necessarily be the option to do that. Like, how would you navigate that for and again, the bit I love about mediation is it's independent. You're not necessarily taking any sides or anything like that. You're just looking at it from the perspective of both parties and trying to figure out, which again I find really helpful in terms of building trust, because from a leadership perspective, people talk about productivity and how do we increase productivity within the workplace. My view on that is that you build space, as you're describing there, where people feel comfortable sharing suggestions and recognizing efforts from both sides, and that can build an incredible amount of productivity. Trust in itself is a huge leadership pull. It's a lever that you can, again, it takes time. You've got to create the space that we're talking about to deal with this kind of thing. But at the same time, it's okay, there is a real business case for building high trust teams. And as you were sharing that there, the bit I'm hearing a lot in terms of, okay, it's about adding clarity. understanding, did that help or did it complicate it further? And again, giving people time to reflect as well on those. So the follow-up piece seems important too from what you were describing there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And exactly as you say, in terms of that, giving people space, everyone operates differently. And certainly if we take, for example, neurodiversity into that space as well, everyone's brain is different. Everyone's way of operating is completely different. For some people, they may be big reflectors, and actually having, say, the space between that initial pre-mediation conversation, the one-to-one where we're digging into it, and it's, as I say, one-to-one, just a really focused session between then that space and then the joint mediation, which sometimes could be a couple of days, it might be a week or so. Ideally, you want to try and keep it as condensed as possible. But looking at that space where somebody needs to actually let things sit, let things drop into place for them. Some people that can take a lot longer. Some people can do that immediately. People are really different and it will really vary. So having that space is really important. Again, also not coming back a week after the joint mediation, giving it 3 to 4 weeks, allowing things to settle, allowing people to get back into their routines again, normal business as usual, work resuming, and then checking in and seeing what has shifted. Is there anything else that has dropped into place? Is there anything else that's come up that you reflected on? Or is there a new conflict? Is there something else going on there? Again, it's really what is going on for you, what is happening in your life and your work life, and how are you finding things? And I think to come back on your point in terms of people working together versus splitting them up or not, I would argue with all of these things, nuance is key. Everyone is different. Every situation will be different. And I'm never going to promise one size fits all. That's not how it works. That's not at all I wanted to go into mediation.
Work, is it? Yeah,
it's not. Absolutely. I've seen, and I'm sure a bit of a tangent, I've seen so many different programs, situations, all sorts, where you try and put people into a box and it just doesn't work. People aren't that way inclined. People are different and respond differently and need different things. I appreciate this is a bit more of a tangent. One of my favorite quotes or pieces that I remember reading a while ago is about people are like flowers and plants, and we need something different every day. We need maybe a bit more sunlight, maybe a bit more water. It's a constant changing feast. We are complex creatures, which is great and challenging in equal measure, but we all need something a little bit different. So in terms of tackling that situation of do we stay, do we go, how do we deal with this? Again, for me, it's getting really deep so we can understand what's underneath the surface before we then look at where do we go from here. And again, coming back to the consent-driven piece and the option for anybody at any point to step out, I appreciate that may come across certainly for a business owner potentially, or someone that's obviously investing in this process, to go, no, but I need to sort this out. I need you to get in there and then get out and deal with that. But it's one where it may seem a bit counterintuitive, but actually, again, it's empowering the individuals within 100%. That space to know that ultimately that's going to create stronger trust. It's going to create better rapport. And again, that feeling of, I want them to be there because they want to be there. I don't want to be dragging anyone through kicking and screaming, because ultimately that's not going to have the outcome that we really want. We want to get to a place of better trust. We want to look at rebuilding relationships wherever we can. Absolutely. That's the overall outcome, but it's got to be done in a genuine way where it isn't trying to think about the carrot versus the stick, right? If you're just bashing people over the head, it's not always the most effective leadership technique. Are they really going to be bought into what you're trying to do, what you're trying to promote, the environment you're trying to create there? Or are they just fearful? So for me, it's finding that balance of, we want to pull people together who want to get involved with this process. They want to try it, knowing they have the freedom and the opportunity to step out at any point if they need to.
Yeah, 100%. I find that with that, is again, from how do you achieve a mission, to give people the autonomy to get there in a way that's healthy for them too, and collaborative more. That's a big part of leadership and navigating, whether it be the mission you're on as a business or a conflict that's occurring within the organization. What would you say is what would a repaired working relationship look like 6 months on? Again, we're talking about here, we're having a conversation really about the process and almost the recipe of what a good mediation would look like. But it seems to me as well, you've mentioned before when we've spoke about the follow-up's quite important too. So perhaps have you got like a story you could share with us that kind of takes us through what good looks like, and something that, again, when it is repaired, because they can be repaired, relationships, as you say, the fluid, that it's about giving them the energy that they need and making people feel seen and heard is a big part of that. But what would you say is a good story you could perhaps share around what good looks like, and ultimately, what does a repaired working relationship look like, say 6 months on? Because these things continue, don't they? Even once the mediation's completed, there is still that need for people to come together collaboratively to achieve whatever mission the business is on in delivering their products or services to businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the high level response, and I can obviously certainly go into some stories, but the
Right.
high level response, I think, on that is really a level of openness that they perhaps didn't have before. So for a lot of people, that conflict often looks like a communication breakdown. And whether that's literally people not speaking to each other, avoiding
Right.
each other, it's completely combative, and anytime no one's being heard, it's either they're both throwing stuff at each other verbally, or it's just really combative and really
Right.
challenging, or it's the case of that they're just not sharing the real crux of the issue. So for me, a big part of looking at what success looks like ultimately 6 months on is not saying that there's no conflict. And I think this is a big sort of misunderstanding potentially, that it might seem on the surface, actually, no conflict is great and we want that. I would absolutely argue that actually conflict handled well and productively it breeds innovation. Teams that disagree well are able to
Mhm.
get to different understandings. They're able to build their learning, build their understanding on a certain
Absolutely.
topic, and be able to ultimately, again, it's all of this is helping a business. You're able to deliver better projects. You're able to provide more creative solutions when you have that openness and that trust and that great culture that allows people to disagree. I think that's a really important piece that I always want to pull out. So for me, it's being
Absolutely.
able to disagree. So again, looking at that 6 month element, it's looking at, say, two team members that have been in conflict previously, what good would look like later on. Is they're able to
Right.
disagree, they're able to raise if they don't agree with something. If there's a particular route that one team member's trying to go down, the other team member may say, actually, I don't think that bit is a good idea because XYZ, and sharing their understanding. That for me, that's openness, that's vulnerability, that's sharing your thoughts in a space that you know that you will be seen and heard ultimately.
Absolutely. And people genuinely tend to learn more from others that they disagree with, more so than people that they agree with. So it is that understanding of it, it's coming from a place of understanding and growth and finding that common ground. Again, I think it's a great, your business, the business name, it really encapsulates what you're trying to achieve around being able to bring people together and pull them together in a way that's achieving ultimately whatever their role is, their business role, their goals, their personal goals as well, which hopefully are aligned with the business goal, because that again makes things a hell of a lot more straightforward when you're running a business. But at the same time, it's trying to figure out a way to get people on board with that. And it's very much, it's a hearts and minds piece. It's a culture piece as well, what you're trying to stand for
Absolutely.
within a business. Again, it's something you mentioned previously that you had a situation, a bit of a story drawing on your experiences over nearly a decade in working in people ops. And from memory, it was a manufacturing organization, and somebody within the organization had perhaps shared some xenophobic language. And tell me more about that. What happened there?
Yeah, absolutely. To really set the scene, this was immediately post Brexit in the UK, really challenging environment, really tense. A lot of people sort of 50-50 whether Britain left the EU or whether we stayed in the EU. And people felt really passionately about either side. I would argue they absolutely still do. It's a very interesting political situation. And so it was a tense environment in general. As you say, it was a manufacturing environment. And we had a member of staff, so I was working in HR at that point. I was pretty early on in my career, actually, and we had someone come into the HR department raising an issue where someone else in their team had been using xenophobic language in a shared space, in an open space, and this person felt really unhappy about it, understandably. There was a lot of, I think what was so interesting about the situation is that there was so much reticence with this person. So if we think about all of the different barriers to entry that it's taken, a situation has occurred. Somebody shares something with someone else that's trusted, a partner, a friend, whoever that is. Someone then shares that even further. Someone shares that formally, i.e.,
Right.
coming to HR, coming to a separate department within the business to say, actually, this thing has happened and I don't feel great about it. For me,
Right.
it's thinking, there are so many different barriers. There are so many different gates, for want of a better word, to think about that individual and all of the different mental steps they've had to take there. So the fact that person was even in HR was huge. And I really wanted to recognize that. And I could see the way, even whilst they were telling me about this situation, there was a sort of almost a physical, but also an emotional stepping in, stepping out, and trying to diminish the situation, trying to say, I want to raise anything formal. I don't want to raise anything formal. And so for me, it was at that point, even was holding up a mirror and saying, you've come to us, therefore this is important to you. There is something that has happened here. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't important, and trying to get that message across, create obviously that safe environment for them to share this situation. And again, over the course of our conversation, they shared that their wife had recommended that they come to HR. They weren't sleeping properly. They were having these physiological experiences. And so during the course of our conversation, I referred back to that at the various points where they were looking to back out and say, actually, never mind, I ignore it and I retract it and all of this. We're saying, but you have come here for a reason. Let's look at what we do here.
The bit that I'm hearing the most there is you had a trust between you and this person and the other party. And that's the bit that I find that, again, that could certainly help the whole conversation to begin with. And the bit I'm hearing as well is that you led with curiosity. That's the bit that seems very, again, coming back to the whole, what's the recipe for a good mediation? It's figuring out the other person's side of the story and figuring out the context behind why they're sharing what they're sharing.
Absolutely. And I think to lead on that as well, so not only leading with curiosity, but for me, it was really important to allowing this person to be seen and heard. And I know we've said that a lot, but it really bears repeating. So for me, it was working with that person to understand what's the ideal outcome here. And again, based on what they had shared, we were saying, based on what we have heard, that's not inappropriate behaviour based on this organisation. We can look at going down that formal route. And they were really clear to say, absolutely not, don't want to do any of that. And so again, it was a lot of teasing back and forth of, okay, but where do you want this to go? What do you want to do here? Because you've come to us for a reason. You wouldn't share this if you didn't want something to happen. So it was that teasing out of, what does good look like for you? What is the ideal outcome here? And that's where mediation came up as, actually, shall we have this conversation? Shall we look at holding this in a safe space, in a protected space, and having that facilitated conversation where we can look at, ultimately, they both worked in the same team. So, they were going to be continued to work with each other and see each other on a regular basis. How do we find the best route forward here? So again, it was really centering that person, understanding, what do you want here ultimately, and then where can we look to move forward? Separately, then the accused person, I had been working with them on a completely separate issue, with their mental health. So I already had an existing relationship with them. So I was able to quite quickly then go into that conversation on a one-to-one basis, again, effectively that pre-mediation situation, and say, look, talk to me about what's gone on here. Again, I want to hear your side of the story. I want to understand what the situation was and really look at, okay, how do we move forward from this? How do we get to a place that's constructive for everyone involved? And again, for them, it was a situation of coming with curiosity. It was a really challenging situation for them. They had said these words, made these xenophobic comments, and they hadn't really thought about what it meant. They hadn't really thought about how that would be received by that other person. And it was also then holding space for them and their distress and their guilt, ultimately, how they were feeling in that situation. So again, then coming back to the joint mediation session, again, it was allowing both sides to feel seen and heard. It was allowing that space for the person that was involved to share, this is how I experienced that situation. This really hurt because of X, Y, and Z. Here's the context. And they spoke about their native country and the different challenges and all of the things that were going on in that space. And instantly wasn't in Europe, huge civil unrest, all of these different challenges. They then brought that through, and it was able to create that space where the person who was being accused was able to offer a really sincere apology and to share their situation with the intention of being able to ultimately mend that relationship, as opposed to either bashing someone over the head, saying you've done a bad thing. This was inappropriate, of course, certainly with all the usual language of it's not aligned with company values, etc., etc. But ultimately, the message being received is typically you've been a bad person. So it was able to take that away, whilst also, again, as an internal HR person, creating and ensuring that duty of care for both parties, where we're absolutely supporting everyone that's involved there.
And that is exactly right for the two people in the room. In this case, I think what I find a lot of business leaders miss, and owners of businesses especially, the moment that something like this has occurred, so xenophobic language in this case, even though the person suffering didn't necessarily want a formal process, but the moment you know about it, you are on the hook whether or not the person wants a process to happen. So mediation is fantastic in terms of, as you were sharing there, repairing the relationship, but it doesn't necessarily touch on the liability aspect of what's being said. So it's about knowing that you need both aspects here. You need the, how do we address the liability? How do we address the personal relationship rebuilding? And mediation's fantastic for that. So I genuinely find that's the bit a lot of business leaders miss. And whether it's looking at the policies, the leadership training that's occurring, training generally within the business to avoid that happening again in the workplace, that's a big part of this too. And you mentioned, again, coming back to some of the stories that you've got and having to, and what the learning points were. You mentioned as well there was a defence tech case where perhaps somebody had raised a homophobic comment, I believe. Can you give us a bit more information around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there's a context for that. It was a private contractor working predominantly within the defence space. A lot of people, a lot of my colleagues were ex-forces, so, Army and RAF in particular. And I was internal HR at that point. Again, I was in an open plan office, and someone who was team leader level made a homophobic joke comment in that space where I was physically present, and they caught my eye and I caught theirs. And again, for me, this was a case of, okay, what's being said there is not wholly appropriate for the workspace, and certainly not for the private sector. That language isn't appropriate in this context. But how do we tackle this in a way that is about thinking about the most constructive way of dealing with that? Again, we could go in hard immediately. We could go for that knee-jerk response of, person did a bad thing, let's whack them over the head. But ultimately, if we think about the longer term sustainable option, how can we come at this with curiosity that centers that person and comes with curiosity and comes with what's going on here? Let's talk about this because this situation isn't appropriate. So let's have a conversation. But let's have a conversation, let's not whack you over the head. So what I did in that situation, and again, it was someone I had a really good working relationship with. I'd already built up trust there. I then took them aside, when I had the time, and said, let's just have a quick chat, shall we? Right. And again, the sort of tail between the legs, there was definitely a sense of they'd gone, oh, I know exactly what you're going to talk to me about. And I know they knew what the situation was and obviously went into it and was clarifying. For me, it was, again, very much coming with curiosity. It was understanding, okay, so you made this comment. And I just asked them a really simple question of, if there was someone who was LGBTQ plus in that space, how do you think they might have heard that? How do you think they might have felt if they had heard that conversation? And it wasn't, oh my goodness, you're a terrible person. Oh my goodness, you've said this really horrible thing. It was just coming from a much lighter space, and a space of, I'm curious about what you think, and how, again, it's holding up that mirror. It's asking a question of, how do you think they would have responded to that? And this person then immediately went into this sort of, oh my goodness, I knew as soon as I said it, I knew it was wrong. And again, I hadn't said at any point, this is bad, you are bad. None of that at all. Right. But they immediately come into all of this openness and vulnerability around, I'm struggling with this in my family, and there's all of this going on. And again, for me, it was there's always something that is underneath it. There's always something underneath all of those actions and behaviors and words, and there's something else going on there. So we were able to get to the crux of ultimately establishing that's inappropriate language for the workplace and we don't want you to do it again, but in a way that absolutely centers that person and creates that space and creates that openness to say, I'm curious why. Teach me and educate me about why that has come to this situation. So ultimately, we're better understanding the situation and we can find a better solution to move forward.
And the solution, a lot of the time, people don't realize that it's not necessarily the exposure isn't only limited to the person who's perhaps within part of a conversation. It could even be the anyone else that's overheard that conversation. It doesn't necessarily need to be directed at anybody in particular. And yeah, if an employer's now got the record of that, it's you're essentially knowing and not necessarily acting. So it's about understanding that you need both aspects there to avoid any potential liability concerns. And that, and again, like you say, it's very educational, coming from a place of understanding first, but at the same time, making it clear through coaching, through making sure that you can reset people's expectations, because ultimately people will always have their reasons. The reasons don't necessarily justify the actions, though. It's about navigating that in a way where you can make sure it doesn't happen again. But evidence is such a big part of that too. What I would say is that these kind of things become a lot more challenging, especially given the climate we're in. We're having this conversation July 2026. In only a couple of months' time, things like the tribunal windows are doubling. So currently people can raise claims within 3 months of an act taking place. That's going to be doubling to 6 months from October this year. So nobody's really connected this to mediation yet. And I think that's a thread we can certainly look at now. And it's something that, again, it can avoid these situations. And I'm a big fan, if you've listened to this podcast before, a lot of what we chat about is prevention's better than cure. And we much prefer to avoid problems escalating before they become massive challenges or legal battles in this case for businesses. We've spoken about this before, and I think this is a good kind of segue when you're looking at challenges. Since AI has become a big part of everybody's lives in business, and that one of the challenges I see a lot from a people ops perspective is that an AI can write what could effectively be like a 30-page grievance in 4 minutes very quickly. And the cost of generating a complaint really is collapsed from the perspective of if anybody wants to raise a complaint, they can push it through an AI model. And now with the window doubling effectively for people to raise claims, we're seeing a huge amount of volume up. The exposure is going up as well. Perhaps the patience for this needs to go up too, in my view, because it's just part of the climate. We have to adapt to it. What's your view on this? How do you address that, given what you and I know this is something that does happen? What's your view on it?
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned this. I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. So I think in terms of the rise of, as you say, accessibility and access to generative AI models for the vast majority of people, as you say, there's this massive increase in AI generated grievances, as you say, 20, 30 page documents. When you think about either your internal HR teams or your external consultants, the time that it takes even just to read that and to understand what's being said, let alone tackling the kind of legalese language that's being used and the claims that are being added in there. I think for me, again, this all comes back down to the trust and the culture. I would potentially argue that if you have multiple employees are raising 20 plus page AI generated grievances, that's going to be a cultural issue. There's a reason why that's happening. Is it that they don't feel like they've been heard in any other way? Do you say have employee engagement surveys or not? And they don't feel like the recommendations are being acted upon? Have you maybe got high attrition, a high turnaround of your staff? Maybe you're struggling to recruit. There could be all of these different pieces going together. So for me, again, it's always coming from curiosity. Why has this person felt the need to raise a 20-page document, which in itself is huge?
Right.
They're obviously feeling something there. There's a big amount of emotion there. And I think in terms of, I'm not going to get too much in terms of the sort of the HR business partner approach and things like that, because that's not the space I'm in anymore. For me, it's coming back to, say, employment lawyers and thinking about a webinar I was recently on this very topic around deepfakes and AI manipulated evidence, which I know absolutely terrifies a lot of people, both on the HR side and the business side.
100%.
It doctored screenshots and all this kind of thing. And I appreciate, again, there can be a knee-jerk reaction of, oh my goodness, how on earth are we going to tackle this? This is terrifying. This is going to rip my business apart. My HR team aren't ever going to be able to have the time to tackle any of this. For me, what I really appreciated about the recent webinar that I was on with an employment lawyer was coming back to let's diffuse the situation, let's de-escalate this, let's bring it back down to what is a reasonable and proportionate response here. So again, it's not going, oh my goodness, this is terrible, kick that out, immediately hammer down all of this. It's, let's take a beat, let's take a breather, let's look at what's being presented here. And again, that might be, say, a 20-page document comes across the desk of an HR person. It might be, let's actually have a conversation with them first. Outside of that formal process, let's get them to explain this grievance in their own words, talk us through it, rather than, say, spending what could be hours or potentially days dissecting every single point in that grievance document, when actually perhaps it's not really expressed in the way the employee is meant to share that. But I think for me, again, it comes back down to that trust and that relationship and that cultural element for sure.
Absolutely. And again, offering a bit more of an insight from the business partner's perspective on the legal side, really, of what's the implication of this? Why is this important? Why are we talking about it now? That we've had additional governance, additional regulations that businesses are now subject to around whether it's the preventative duty, taking all reasonable steps to avoid harassment in the workplace. We've had sexual harassment being automatically a qualifying disclosure for whistleblowing purposes. This overrides everything from confidentiality clauses and settlement agreements. So these are, again, that's an example of that's already enforced now as we speak. Going into October, we've got things like third-party harassment claims that can come from customers, suppliers, contractors. These are all protected characteristics that we're focusing on here. So it's not only sexual harassment from October, it could be other protected characteristics too. And one-off incidents count towards that. So it's really key to be getting good advice around this too. That we've already touched on tribunal claims doubling. The amount of claims that are going through the system now are huge. Your tribunal claim timing, again, doubling from October this year. So exploring these options, mediation, again, is a big option to this, is potentially a way forward where you're finding owners really have got a much higher bar now that they have to work towards. And before anybody tells them where this bar is, it's really important to consider, is mediation a good fit and an intervention to potentially speed up the resolution, but also I'd see it as a value add that it's going to ultimately reduce potential cost exposure for businesses too. Yeah, I think AI generated grievances are just another part of being able to adapt as a business to the current climate we're in at the moment. What was your key takeaway? What would your key takeaway be in terms of if you do find that you're subject to perhaps an AI generated grievance? Like you mentioned about leading with curiosity there. When you look at the current of what's underneath it, does it typically boil down to perhaps a few aspects of where the challenge is coming from? Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, and I guess I also want to draw on your point. I certainly don't want to be misunderstood in terms of, if we take a situation like a sexual harassment case, I really don't want to understate that situation and how delicate it is to manage so many of those pieces. I appreciate, and again, from almost that sort of trauma-informed response of knowing how people operate in these situations. If someone is alleging that behaviour, that's a really delicate balance, and to hold that space for it and to go through the relevant process. Again, that's not the space I'm in. That's not the space that I'm working in.
Do you find that there are perhaps themes underneath it where you've got a 30-page grievance? How do you break that down in terms of, again, from what you shared earlier, I get that we've got to be asking that, okay, what's the outcome you're looking for having raised this? That can really build the destination in terms of how you resolve it. But have you noticed any kind of themes and trends that pop up where, yeah, it might be 30 pages, however, there might be some repetition in there where it's essentially the undercurrent's very much the same?
Yeah. So again, coming back to the whole underlying element of everyone is different and every situation is unique. Of course, there absolutely may be some underlying themes for sure. I think for me, a big piece that I really see, again, coming back to that same element of, it's, for a lot of people, it's about not feeling seen or heard. And there is something going on, whether it's a change that's happened, whether there's a situation with another colleague, something going on where that person isn't being seen and heard. And again, to speak to the concept of the grievance process, and you and I both know, and I'm sure any HR practitioner listening will be able to relate, at that point that the grievance has been raised, you're already so far through that process. This person has either experienced a situation, has gone through something, something, and they're at a point where that is a formal process. So again, if we think about all of those different barriers to entry, all of those different gates that person, those metaphorical gates that person has to have had passed through to be able to get to the grievance, yes, of course, it's much easier physically to generate that document with AI, etc. But to be able to get to that point of raising it formally, there's a lot that they've already, in theory, that they've already gone through to get to that point. So, you know, again, in terms of approaching it, it would be understanding it. Again, are there any key themes that are coming through, highlighting that? And again, for me, I'm certainly not going to tell HR business partners how to do their jobs, but looking at that, let me reflect this back. What I've understood from your grievance, your 20-page grievance document is this and this are the key themes. Have I got that right? Before you're then going into, even if it's email back and forth, whether it's formal letters, whatever that looks like, obviously that is a huge amount of time and effort and energy on both sides, being able to briefly establish, have I got this correct? And giving them the opportunity for that so that they are being seen and heard throughout that process.
Yeah, genuinely. I find, again, we're approaching it from the HR doctor's perspective, more so from the governance piece, as you were describing there. And one thing I find particularly helpful for business leaders is to frame it in a way that we're looking at what's proportionate, what's fair, what's reasonable in the circumstances. We don't necessarily have a criminal standard. So it's not, we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that something's occurred. So it's about, again, using those tools. And again, some of what you've shared there is incredibly useful from a people ops perspective as well. If somebody's doing an investigation, they need to be leading with curiosity and not necessarily having any assumptions early on. It's about proving those assumptions. What evidence is there? Witness statements, whatever it might be that's been brought up through the AI generated grievance, and trying to, again, find the truth of the situation. And again, I find it that this is a good sort of segue really into sometimes the mature truth of the situation could be that there needs to be an honest outcome of an exit. I mean, how would you navigate that from a mediation perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, drawing on what I mentioned earlier in terms of the autonomy piece, for me, it's I'm facilitating that conversation. I am not guiding someone to a specific outcome in the same way. And just to briefly touch on the investigation piece, any good investigator is going in, as you say, with curiosity and is looking to establish the facts. Again, just to briefly mention on the AI piece, if someone has doctored screenshots, for example, in the same way years ago, you'd have been able to rely on, say, a text or a WhatsApp or an email screenshot, knowing that those can be relatively easily doctored. Again, coming back to the whole, we're not looking at beyond reasonable doubt. We're looking at how likely is it that this thing happened. And again, from an investigation, that's speaking to multiple people. That's gathering multiple different types of evidence. So, for example, you're not just exclusively relying on screenshots. The employment lawyers are indicating things like, say, WhatsApp. You can gather the metadata, so you can actually try and go to the source of it. But again, we're not doing a forensic investigation here. There are limits to the time, to the availability, to the resources, etc. That being said, on the sort of the investigation piece, in terms of that mediation conversation, where if it's looking likely that actually the common ground is incredibly thin and actually there is very little overlap there, and actually the disagreements are too big, and it's looking like it's maybe best that actually this individual doesn't stay with the company. There isn't enough overlap here, or perhaps the trust is broken beyond all reasonable, all repair. Then, as you say, identifying that actually an exit is probably the route that we take. For me, again, because I am impartial, because I am not giving guidance and advice, I'm very much there to facilitate that conversation. The concept is very much that the individuals in that space, they are the ones that have the answers. So for me, it's asking the right questions to be able to, again, metaphorically hold up that mirror for them, to get them to see that on their own terms, to come to their own conclusion, and appreciate that's not always the case. And there are a huge amount of reasons as to why someone may be unwilling to see that or unwilling to accept that. That, again, is not in the remit of what I'm doing. I'm not there to guide a specific outcome. I'm very much there to offer suggestions and use questions to help people guide themselves to their own outcomes. If it is the case where it becomes very clear to me that I think actually an exit is best there, I will do what I can to help facilitate that space for them. But if there's no element there, then it might be that's a conversation I'd say have with the business owner at the end to say, we had a great session, but you might want to consider that this is a potential sort of outcome here. But again, looking at mediation as that pause. You pause all of the other processes, you go through mediation. If it's not resolved in that space, then, you revert to, for example, if it's a disciplinary issue, if it's a performance management issue, if it's potentially then also going into, say, a protected conversation with that individual. There are lots of different options that you can go for with that. But as I say, I do really want to reiterate that mediation is that impartial. I'm not pushing you towards any specific goal. It's really helping you as the participants to look at the situation in different perspective.
Like you say, and it's context driven as well. It very much depends. Sometimes mediation isn't always about staying together. Sometimes it is about working through the challenges and finding a way forward that's a win-win for everybody. It's great for people to understand that's one of the options that's available through this. It's not only about bringing people together. What I find is, especially when we're looking at, is it the right time for an exit? From a people ops perspective, from a governance point of view, over the years, over the couple of decades I've done this, what I find to be a theme and trend is there's not necessarily, sometimes the values don't necessarily align between the parties, and where the values don't align, then the right outcome could be a departure in that circumstance. And the bit that I'm hearing throughout this podcast really as well from your side is that when you're mediating these kind of challenges, it's about keeping it human as well, and understanding that it's okay sometimes to have a disagreement on things. But when it gets to a point where perhaps there is that you've not caught it early enough, which again, that's a big part of this podcast. It's about what can employers do to catch conflict early before it escalates into becoming a problem, and mediation's a big part of that solution, I find, in those circumstances. Yeah, sometimes the honest outcome could be an exit. It might not necessarily be. Again, it's very context driven. Like we say, we've got to really caveat that. You don't want to be applying this like a stereotype to every situation. That isn't how it works with people or in business for that matter. You've got to be adaptable. But at the same time, if people are at that stage, it's giving them an understanding that, look, that could be one of the options available to you as well. And that's okay too. Where people's values don't align, that's a big part of deciding, is that really the point where staying together isn't really viable? And again, that's important for employers to understand that too. From an outcome perspective, we're focused a bit more now what an exit would look like. I find it's a really good place for employers if they're thinking, okay, what's next? I'd be saying, ask your leaders, who are they worried about? Who are they worried about at the moment? That's probably a good place for them to start in deciding, okay, do we perhaps need to look at mediation as an option? What would you say are some of the things an owner can do this week if they're considering what's next? So when the outcome is an exit, what would you consider to be the top 3 things for people to look at?
When we come to that piece, and I'm really glad you mentioned this in general, I think it's a really interesting and potentially contentious topic, I appreciate, when it comes to the concept of exits. And I think it's a really important adult conversation to be had of, as you say, there may get to a point where either the trust has been broken beyond all repair, or perhaps the values have shifted, perhaps the direction has shifted so substantially that there is no reconciling that. And I know that certainly with some leaders, there may be the case of we're trying to hold it together at all costs, but actually that can be so detrimental to the rest of the team, to the business. Again, I'm sure any HR practitioner listening to this will be able to think of a situation where that's actually been so much more damaging for that person to stay within a team, within an organization. So identifying that is, you're looking at, obviously, legally, from a government's perspective, you obviously want to exhaust all other options and really look at that. And again, mediation is a great option for that, to go through that process. Is there something else we can do to salvage this relationship? If not, if we've tried everything as well, then looking at, okay, this is then an exit conversation. I think, and again, not to speak too much on the HR business partnering side, but thinking about the performance versus capability element, I think there's so much in that around, why is it that this person isn't aligned? Is it they haven't been given the tools to complete their job? Is it that no one has really told them about what they should be doing? Is it that the ground has shifted beneath their feet and no one shared that with them? There are so many situations. Or is it they simply they're no longer capable of doing that job that they were employed to do.
Pulling that thread of understanding. So we've gone through that process of figuring out, is mediation the right tool in this case? And if it is, perhaps you've got to a point throughout that mediation, the steps that you've gone through around understanding, okay, from an owner's perspective or the business leader's perspective, when the outcome is an exit in this case, what are going to be the things that they need to do this week, ideally, to figure out, okay, what's the next step? So we touched on ask your managers who they're worried about, and not what are they worried about, but who are they worried about within their organization, so they can focus on any next steps in terms of, okay, what's the next? Once you've identified the challenge, mediation can be a big part of that too, because you're working through, you've already found the challenge at that point. And then we were looking at, okay, when the outcome is an exit, what would be, again, approaching it from the mediator's perspective, what would you be recommending employers do, either to avoid that situation popping up again, or in terms of maybe even listing the liability? Write down what you already know, what wasn't acted on, and list that liability. So again, it's about defining the problem, so you can then, I suppose, plug it into trying to find the common ground.
You've got a business owner, a business leader has gone through that situation, and they're looking at, again, lessons learned. How do we best support this going forward? I think there's a number of different aspects. I think firstly, again, it's the most human way through. It's leading with curiosity. I'd say it's really looking at that shift in baseline. So if we're thinking about, is there maybe someone in our organization where the behavior shifted a little bit? Again, it's starting that early, coming back to the whole prevention over cure of get curious, have that open conversation early, establish that relationship, really create that openness. And I think particularly consistency. I've certainly seen throughout my career, and again, I'm sure every HR practitioner will be able to relate, the concept of one-to-ones and how quickly they drop off the radar and how quickly they're the first thing to go when things get busy. That's really your great sense check of what's actually going on with the team. Yes, of course, you can do the operational stuff, and that's important. Emotionally, like temperature check. Where are they at? What's actually going on? Is there maybe something else under the surface? Have they been late on a couple of different projects or tasks or whatever? And maybe there's something actually going on there. So being able to identify those early, certainly again, thinking from a liability and a governance and a legal perspective, again, bringing in the human element. For me, it's a lot of guidance certainly around disciplinary action and things like this. And certainly if you're looking at something as extreme as dismissal, is it should never be a surprise to that employee. There should always have been so many steps before that. So for me, that comes right back to the most informal conversations, the most informal discussions of, say, if it's performance, if it's attitude, if there's something else going on there. It's as soon as that behavior or that action has been taken, it's going, can we just have a quick chat about this? Whether it's an email, whether it's a verbal conversation, whatever that looks like. Again, it's that if the behavior or the action is inappropriate, it's having that conversation as early as possible, so that, again, if it continues, if there's further issues there, again, it's documenting it. It's making sure that you spoke to Joe Bloggs on this date, spoke to Joe Bloggs again on this date, sent an email. You've got not only the paper trail, but you've got that we've had this conversation. This is not a surprise. So that if, again, you then need to go down that formal route, or you say, actually, I'm actually getting really concerned about your behavior or your performance, or again, whatever the situation is, you can go into that conversation knowing that this isn't going to be, I had absolutely no idea, because you've gone, actually, we had this conversation here. I sent you this email on here. There is that pattern of behavior. And so it's not a surprise and completely out of the blue, because you're also going to get people are most likely to then be defensive, get their backs up. And again, everything just escalates so much quicker.
Yeah, and it seems that's a big part of, again, managing expectations is what I'm hearing there. If an owner's sensing something isn't quite right, but they can't name it, what's the first move that they need to be taking? I'd say having that conversation, shedding some light on whatever the challenge is, and depersonalizing it too, saying it's not about them necessarily. It's, I'm noticing this, reflect on it. Yeah, am I off piece here? They're really useful tools to be able to, hopefully, again, like you say, prevention's better than cure, avoid it becoming a bigger challenge. And, addressing that early on is a big part of the whole communication piece too. What I would encourage, and again, everybody to do who's listening to this podcast, is consider perhaps having 15 minutes with every leaver. So before they leave, trying to understand before they go, not necessarily after, what would be the reasons behind leaving, we've already established, certainly the research I was doing leading into this podcast, it was looking at 2 in 3 of leavers don't actually shed light on the conflict when it's part of during their employment. It only happens after. That's a big part of being able to have a culture of transparency and openness and figuring out what the challenge is. So you can ultimately figure out the solution as well together. That's a big part of the mediation piece. It's very collaborative. Yeah, I genuinely find just having those conversations with people, and if people are going to leave, then spend 15 minutes and figure out what's the reason behind them going. And if we know that 2 in 3 have never told anybody about what's going on or the conflict they've experienced, then that's a big part of being able to hopefully avoid that situation popping up again. We already know that there's a huge cost involved in people leaving. Recruitment's incredibly expensive, and keeping people who are productive, who are healthy in the workplace, who are enjoying the work that they do, that's a big part of being a business leader too. It's the responsibility of keeping and cultivating a great culture within the workforce. So yeah, I genuinely find that would be super helpful for business leaders when they consider it. Okay, do we explore mediation as an option? Absolutely. And it plugs into the mission that you're on with Common Ground as well. It's such a big part of the human aspect of businesses. Businesses are inextricably linked to people. We rely on people to deliver on the mission and products and services that we're providing to our customers. So using these as a tool in the toolbox that you can ultimately use in a way that's healthy for the team too, which is a big part of, a big part of the mission that you're on with Common Ground. So what would you say, coming back to the mediation point, like what would be, if there wasn't one myth that you could look to just remove for good, what would be that myth? What would be the myth that you'd like to end when it comes to mediation?
It's a good question. I'll be honest, I don't really have one sort of straightforward answer with it, because I think the challenge is more that
there's a lot of nuance to it, yeah.
Well, a number of people haven't heard of mediation. So it's almost, right. I think if we were to ask what's a myth to dispel about HR practitioners, I could give you plenty. But I think with mediation, it's almost more challenging because a lot of people just purely haven't heard or really know anything about it at all. I think probably the one piece that I always want to reiterate is the fact that it doesn't stop or negate any other formal or legal processes. So it's not an either or situation. It's very much a win-win of let's try something different, but if it turns out actually mediation isn't the right route for it, you can still go down those formal and legal routes if you need to. You've not missed out on anything. It's just trying to divert the process and see, is there something different we can do? Can we approach this in a different way and try something new? Again, knowing that it's much quicker, much cheaper than going down any of those legal routes.
Absolutely. If people want to get in touch with you, like what's the best way? Tell us a little bit more about how they can get in touch with you. If anything that we've spoken about today resonates, you can get in touch with you through socials. What's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So LinkedIn, definitely the best place. I post very regularly, very intentionally. So you get to, obviously I talk a lot about mediation, but also my background in HR and a lot on the personal development side. So I'm really big on showing how I operate, how I think as well. It's such a personal service that I offer. I always want to make sure that people know what they're getting into before we even have a conversation. So definitely feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Kirstie Buck. Also got my business page there as well. So Common Ground Workplace Mediation. Look out for the green sprout, very intentional. I'm really pleased with what I've created and really very intentionally created Common Ground, as we've spoken throughout, around finding that common ground, finding that overlap, finding that space, knowing that there's more that unites us and really seeking that. But the sprout, again, very intentionally, it's about growth. It's about opening up, it's about blossoming, it's about starting somewhere and being able to develop and grow. So it's a lot around personal growth. And again, the nature piece that I know we've spoken about of people need different things at different times. We're not robots. 100%. We're not working in such a methodical way. We need support, extra support at this time. If we're going through a personal crisis, we need a bit of breathing space. We need something different. It's looking at that very much that nature overlap of it's not a one size fits all. It's very deliberately bespoke. That's why I'm running what I'm doing. It's why I want to be able to work with businesses and really get curious about what is the situation here? What is in front of us here, rather than going, okay, I've got my process and policy and procedure and I'm just going to follow that blindly. That is not how I approach it at all.
100%. It's one of the reasons I was super excited to have you on the podcast today, because it aligns so much with the values, the mission we're on. We're very much there with the HR Doctor to support growth-minded leaders. And one of the most effective ways to build engagement within the workforce is to grow with the team and to give the team opportunities to grow. I find mediation is a fantastic way to do that as well. It's a growth opportunity through empathy, and aligning it to nature is such a powerful thing as well. Because it does genuinely help people grow as individuals too. And when you've got that aspect of working with a growth-minded leader, they understand that people need that in order to achieve their own personal goals too. It's a big part of finding that win-win, which again, that's a big part of mediation too. So it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.